I really didn't like my wife's makeup during our wedding. That is probably one of the worst things I have ever admitted out loud, because saying it makes me sound like an ungrateful husband who cared more about his wife's appearance than the fact that he was marrying the woman he loved. And maybe in some ways I deserved that criticism. But the truth is that I had been thinking about that moment for months. I had imagined seeing her walk down the aisle so many times that I had practically created the scene in my head. I pictured the doors opening, everyone turning around, and then seeing my wife for the first time in her wedding dress. I imagined feeling overwhelmed, maybe even crying. Instead, when the doors opened, my first thought was, what happened to her face? And the worst part is that I immediately felt guilty for thinking it. My wife, who I'll call Emma, has always been beautiful to me. She isn't someone who wears a lot of makeup either. Most days she barely wears anything besides maybe some mascara and lip gloss. That's actually one of the things I loved about her. She always looked like herself. When we first started dating, I remember telling my friends that she had this natural beauty that didn't need much effort. She would wake up with messy hair, throw on a hoodie, and somehow still look better than most people who had spent an hour getting ready. I never wanted her to change that. So when she told me she had booked a professional makeup artist for the wedding, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it would just make her look like a slightly more polished version of herself. A few weeks before the wedding, she went for a trial appointment. When she came home, I was sitting on the couch watching television. She walked into the room and asked me what I thought. I looked at her and honestly I didn't like it. Her makeup was much heavier than what she normally wore. Her foundation looked completely different from her normal skin tone, her eyes were dramatically darker, and her eyelashes were so long that I noticed them before I noticed anything else. But instead of telling her I didn't like it, I smiled and said, "You look beautiful." She stared at me for a second and asked, "Really?" I said yes. Looking back, that was my first mistake. The reason I didn't tell her the truth was because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. She had been incredibly excited about the wedding, and I didn't want to become the husband who criticized his future wife's appearance. I also assumed that the trial makeup wasn't necessarily what she would wear on the actual day. Maybe she had asked for something dramatic because it was just a trial. Maybe the lighting was different. Maybe it would look better with her wedding dress and hairstyle. So I convinced myself it wasn't worth mentioning. I figured she was happy and that was what mattered. Then came the wedding day. I woke up that morning feeling like I was going to throw up. Not because I didn't want to marry her. Quite the opposite. I was nervous because I knew I was about to make the biggest commitment of my life. Everything around me felt surreal. My friends were joking with me, my parents kept checking whether I needed anything, and the photographer was constantly taking pictures. I remember looking at the clock and thinking, in a few hours I'll be someone's husband. When the ceremony finally started, I stood at the front with my best friend beside me. The music began and people started turning toward the entrance. Then the doors opened, and there she was. For about 2 seconds I didn't process anything except the fact that she was walking toward me. Then I noticed her makeup. It was even heavier than the trial. Her foundation was extremely full coverage. Her eyes were dark and smoky, her eyelashes were enormous, and her lips were a shade I had never seen her wear before. She looked completely different from the woman I had spent the last several years with. My stomach dropped. I know how horrible that sounds. She was standing there in a wedding dress walking toward me, and instead of immediately thinking about how beautiful she looked, I was thinking about how unfamiliar she looked. I remember forcing myself to smile because I knew everyone was watching me. I even nodded slightly as if to communicate, "Wow." But inside I was desperately trying to reconcile the person in front of me with the woman I knew. When she finally reached me, she smiled, and that smile changed everything. For a moment I stopped looking at the makeup. I saw her, the same woman who used to steal fries from my plate, the same woman who laughed so hard at stupid jokes that she couldn't breathe. The same woman who had stayed up with me when I was struggling with work, the same woman who had said yes when I asked her to marry me. I smiled back. The ceremony went perfectly. We said our vows, exchanged rings, and kissed. Everyone clapped. There were tears. My mother cried. Emma cried. I thought I was going to cry, but somehow I managed to hold it together. By the time we reached the reception, I had almost completely forgotten about the makeup. Almost, because then came the photographs. The photographer kept telling us to turn our heads, tilt our faces, look at each other, smile, kiss, laugh, and pose. Every time I looked at the pictures on the camera screen, I noticed the same thing. She looked completely different, not ugly, that's important. She wasn't ugly. She looked professionally made up. She looked glamorous. She looked like someone going to a movie premiere, but she didn't look like Emma. And I knew that if I said anything, I could ruin the entire day, so I kept my mouth shut. At the reception, one of her friends complimented her makeup. Another told her she looked like a celebrity. Emma was glowing. She kept thanking everyone, and I could tell she was incredibly happy. Eventually, she came over to me and asked, "Do you like my makeup?" There it was, the question I had been avoiding all day. I looked at her and said, "You look amazing." She smiled and hugged me. Technically, I hadn't lied. She did look amazing. I just hadn't answered the question she actually asked. That night after the reception, we went back to the hotel. We were exhausted. I had been awake since early morning. My feet hurt, my suit felt like it had been wrapped around me with a rope, and Emma had spent the entire day smiling for hundreds of people. She went into the bathroom to take off her makeup. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when she came back out, and there she was. No foundation, no fake eyelashes, no dramatic eyeshadow, no lipstick, just Emma. She looked at me and said, "Finally." I laughed and asked what she meant. She said, "I feel like I haven't looked like myself all day." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I asked her if she liked the makeup. She shrugged and said, I liked it. I wanted to look different for the wedding. I wanted to feel like a bride. Then she looked at me and asked, did you like it? I froze. This time there were no guests around, no photographer, no family members, no friends, no reason to give a polite answer, so I finally told her the truth. I said, honestly, I didn't. She went completely silent. I immediately regretted it. She asked, you didn't like it? I explained that it wasn't that she looked bad. I told her that I thought she looked beautiful, but I didn't like how different she looked from herself. I told her that when the doors opened, I was expecting to see her, and for a second I felt like I was looking at someone else. She stared at me for several seconds, then she started laughing. I was confused. She literally started laughing. She said, are you serious? That's what you've been thinking about all day? I told her yes. She laughed even harder and said, I thought you were going to tell me you hated the dress. I told her I loved the dress. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. She said, I didn't like your hair either. I looked at her. Apparently my barber had given me a haircut she hated. She said she had wanted to tell me before the wedding but didn't because she didn't want to make me insecure. She said my hair looked like I had been attacked by a lawn mower. I started laughing. For the next 20 minutes we sat in that hotel room roasting each other's wedding day decisions. She hated my haircut. I hated her eyelashes. She thought my suit was too tight. I thought her lipstick was too dark. She thought my shoes looked ridiculous. I thought her makeup artist had personally declared war on her natural face, and somehow instead of causing an argument it brought us closer. But there was one thing she said that stayed with me. She told me, you know what I wanted most that day? I wanted you to look at me like I was beautiful. I told her I did. She said, then that's all that matters. The next morning we looked through the wedding photos together. I expected to cringe at every picture, but something strange happened. The more I looked at them, the less I cared about the makeup, because the pictures weren't really about makeup. They were about us. There was one photograph where she was laughing because I whispered something stupid into her ear. Her eyes were half closed, her lipstick was slightly smudged, and I was smiling like an idiot. Another picture showed us dancing while everyone around us watched. Another showed her father wiping away tears during the ceremony. Another showed my mother hugging Emma. And suddenly I realized something embarrassing. I had spent so much time worrying about whether she looked like herself that I had forgotten that the whole point of the day wasn't to look perfect. It was to get married. Years later we still joke about the makeup. Sometimes she'll find one of our wedding pictures and say, look at those eyelashes. And I'll say, look at that haircut. She'll tell me that I looked handsome. I'll tell her she looked beautiful, and then we'll both laugh because we know what we really mean. The funny thing is that if I could go back and change one thing, I wouldn't ask her to wear less makeup. I wouldn't ask her to change her lipstick or eyelashes or foundation. I wouldn't even tell her that I didn't like it. I'd simply tell her the truth about how I felt without making her feel bad about her choices. I'd tell her, you look different from what I'm used to, but you're still the woman I love, because that's what I learned from the whole experience. Sometimes we confuse loving someone's appearance with loving the person themselves. We get so caught up in whether someone looks exactly the way we imagine that we forget that people are allowed to surprise us. My wife wanted to look different on her wedding day. She wanted to feel glamorous. She wanted to look like a bride. And honestly, she deserved to have that experience without worrying about whether I approved of every detail. The makeup wasn't the problem, my expectations were. I had created this perfect image in my head of how my wedding day was supposed to look, and when reality didn't match that picture, my first instinct was disappointment. But marriage taught me something that day that I probably wouldn't have learned from any relationship advice. The person you marry isn't a photograph. They're going to change their hairstyle. They're going to gain weight, lose weight, age, experiment with clothes, try different makeup, have bad hair days, wake up looking exhausted, and sometimes walk around the house wearing clothes that should probably never be seen in public. And you're going to change too. If your love depends on everything staying exactly the way you imagined it, you're going to have a difficult marriage. My wife didn't become less beautiful because she wore heavy makeup that day. She simply looked different. And eventually I realized that different doesn't mean worse, it just means different. So yes, I really didn't like my wife's makeup during our wedding, but I loved my wife, and when I look back at those photographs now, I don't see the makeup anymore. I see the woman who walked toward me and chose me. And honestly, that's the only part of that day I'll ever care about, so that's my confession. I hated the makeup, but I loved the woman underneath it. And after all these years, I think that's probably the most important distinction I could have learned on the day I became her husband. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment for more crazy confessions I get from people.